So these are three, we'll call them marketing images from VR. And let's look at them really quickly. So over on the left, we're looking at automotive immersive design. There's a guy in there with an HMD. He's interacting with a full-scale car. Over on the bottom right, we're watching someone play Minecraft, right, inside a VR, and there's graphical elements superimposed on the furniture in their living room. And then up above, that great Magic Leap image of bringing a virtual whale into elementary school auditorium. And if I had shown you these images maybe 5 years ago, pretty much everyone in this room would have said, that's science fiction, right? That's way out there, that's the future. And even 2 years ago, if I had shown these to you, you would have had a similar response. You would have said, yeah, technology's getting there, but that's still, kind of a ways out. But we're here. This is now. I mean, this isn't necessarily something you can go buy on Amazon, but all of these technologies are available. They're being developed in research labs, and they're being prototyped, as early products. But it all happened really fast, and the technology is incredible. So the question is, how did we get here so fast? And I guess the answer is virtual reality has kind of been happening for a while. It's just that historically it looked a lot more like this, right? It was people in these dedicated immersive rooms, these power walls, these caves. These were incredibly expensive. These cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to build out. And as a result, not that many people got to experience VR. And then, over time, people continued working on the technology. Things continued to improve. The displays got better. The tracking became really solid. The GPUs were tuned to accelerate VR. And then about 2.5 years ago, there was sort of the shot heard around the world, if you will. Facebook wrote a check for $2 billion and bought a company that no one had ever heard of called Oculus. And what this really signaled was two things. One, the technology was just about mature enough to roll out for mainstream use. It's incredible. And number two, Silicon Valley was ready to place really big bets on VR. So with that, a ton of people flocked to the space, which has been great. There's a whole ecosystem now that's being built out. And with that, the expectations are really high. And I'm absolutely convinced that we can do it. We can deliver great experiences. That's what the world is expecting. But it's worth sort of stopping for a second to remind people that, that VR is really hard, and that the history of VR is littered with people who got sick when they put on an HMD, right? If you tried VR in the 90s, or maybe even 5 years ago, you know what I'm talking about. It was not a good experience. And it wasn't a good experience not because we weren't trying hard. Everybody was trying hard. It's really hard to do this technology. And so what I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so doing as kind of a follow-up to Jason's talk is I'm going to pull back the curtain just a little bit. And I'm going to show you some of the technologies that go into making a great VR experience. We'll talk about the challenges, what's hard about graphics, what's hard about audio, and then I'll give you a sneak peek at kind of how it's done. Okay. So we're going to start with graphics and display, partially because we're NVIDIA, but partially because you're Hollywood. Graphics and display has a lot of interesting challenges, and they kind of, on the VR front, they go back to Ivan Sutherland. So here's Ivan Sutherland donning the very first virtual reality system, head-mounted display that he created. So this photo is from back in the 60s. The form factors have gotten a bit better, but it's essentially the same thing, right? He's got tracking, he's got rendering, he's got an embedded display. And so the fundamentals were there. And the difference between a VR display and any other display, they have the same challenges, right? Brightness and resolution and screen refresh and yes, price. So you know, this guy here who worked for NASA and is wearing the NASA head-mounted display, this cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? These things were really, really expensive. And they remain not quite that expensive, but still pretty expensive, kind of out of reach for a very long time. And there was kind of this price impasse, if you will, where because the price was up here, people weren't buying them, and until we had kind of a sufficient volume of people buying them, the price wasn't going to come down. And then a funny thing happened, completely unrelated to VR, which is we all got smartphones, right? And we get to thank smartphones for the fact that display technology became commoditized to the point where, you know, a display like this is tens of dollars, right? And suddenly it was possible to put it inside of HMDs. So, so that was a big deal. And that price coming down solved some of the important problems for displays. It didn't solve all of them, and some of what you'll notice as you go around the room and do the demos is that even though the visuals are beautiful and absolutely amazing, there are still some things that you can't quite see in VR. And the problem is one of resolution, right? So this high-res display that, you know, I can watch Game of Thrones on is a retina display when viewed 9 inches from my face, filling, you know, 20 degrees of my field of view. When I take that same display and I put it 2 inches from my face and lenses that make it fill my entire field of view, I can see the pixels, right? So, so the HMD manufacturers are aware of this as well. They're working very, very hard to increase the resolution of the display. They're going to become even more beautiful over time. Which sort of leads me to the next challenge I want to talk about, which is pixel throughput. So Jason mentioned this earlier, that in a traditional game, for example, if I can maintain 30 frames per second on a 1920 by 1080 screen, that's 60 megapixels per second, right? You just do the math. In an HMD today, we have a 3K display because we're having to render a separate image for left eye and right eye. And now the frame rate requirements just went up dramatically. Now we have kind of a strict bar at 90 frames per second. You drop below that and it's not a good VR experience. When you multiply these numbers and compare them, we're looking at kind of a 7x increase in the demand, in the performance demand. So that's challenging. And as I just alluded to in the previous slide, this is going to get worse because, as I said, when you put on an HMD, you can see these pixels, right? So as this resolution gets better, as these go up to 6K or 12K, the problem just compounded. Okay, so we're going to geek out for a little bit here because we're going to dive into the optics of HMDs to point to how we've addressed this challenge of high pixel throughput. It's only going to last a couple of minutes, but try to keep up. If you don't, it's okay. We'll pop back up in a second. Okay, so if you look at what's going on inside of an HMD, you have lenses. And you have to have lenses in order for your eyes to be able to focus and to fill your field of view with this display that's right in front of you. One of the side effects of having lenses there, though, is that it distorts the image that's on the other side, the image that's being presented on the display. So in order to render an image that's going to look right, we have to essentially pre-distort the image or warp the image so that when viewed through the optics, through the lenses, what you see looks like this. So the way that we do that is that we render the image normally, and then we apply this warp as a very last stage before the image gets sent to the display for you to look at through your head-mounted display. But if we look carefully at what's going on when we're doing that warping, we notice something interesting, which is these pixels right here in the middle pretty much get unchanged when they go into the warped image. But these pixels that are out here on the periphery, they're getting squashed. And what actually happens is a lot of these pixels are simply being thrown away, right? And anytime that work is being thrown away, that's an opportunity for us to be more efficient and to get that speed up that we need. Okay, so we looked at this and we said, gosh, here's an opportunity. We could render what's happening at this outside region at a lower resolution, and then when it gets crushed and we're throwing away pixels, we're not throwing anything away. So this inspired what we call multi-resolution shading. Multi-resolution shading was first supported on NVIDIA's Maxwell architecture and subsequently on Pascal. That's our current generation. And the magic, the way that we did it, is we break up the image plane into a tic-tac-toe board. The portion that's in the middle is rendered at full resolution. These portions on the outside are actually being rendered at lower resolution, and then when you do the warp, nothing is being thrown away. And the technology that makes this possible is our broadcast technology. So the geometry is being broadcast to the different viewports, and then all being rendered simultaneously. We've taken this a step further with our Pascal architecture, and now instead of rendering one resolution in one region and a different lower resolution in the other regions, we have a continuous fall off. And this continuous fall off very nicely matches what's happening with the optics in the lens. So this is a further refinement, again, leading to further savings. So we're just being super efficient about which pixels we're rendering so that no resources, no time are being wasted. The other thing that we can do, again, this is with our Pascal architecture, is we can take advantage of the fact that with VR, we're rendering two very similar images, a left eye image and a right eye image. And so what Pascal has support for is something called single pass stereo. So rather than rendering that exact same image twice, we just send down the geometry once with two separate cameras, and we are able to save what's called a geometry pass. This further accelerates rendering. Again, we need to save every cycle we can, be as efficient as possible in order to hit these frame rates that are required for VR. Okay, so geek mode off. That's how we're doing, that's how we're accelerating our rendering in order to achieve that high throughput that's required. The other part of rendering that I want to talk about is physically based rendering. So Jason showed some great examples of this. He showed that Portland Armory, which, you know, I love when people get up on stage and they get to vote. And the answer is you can't really tell the difference anymore. The rendering has gotten so good that simulated and real, as Jason said, have converged. And so what we're showing here is a rendering of a loft space. And in order to get physically based rendering, we have very, very accurate models of the materials and very, very accurate models of the lights. And having those two, we then put them together in a physically based algorithm where we're tracing photons through the space and seeing where they land and seeing what's visible. And by conforming to the true physics of light transport, we're able to produce images that look like this. This one happens to come from our iRay photorealistic renderer. We did something recently with iRay that I think is really cool, which is that we taught iRay about a new camera. So traditionally, you know, when you went to save out a photorealistic image, you saved out something like this. It looked like a rectangle, looked like a photo that you would put in a frame. We recently taught iRay how to save out spherical stereo panoramas. And they're fantastic, they're very useful, and if you have a chance during the break, come over and see the demo over here, where we can, we'll put the head-mounted display on you. You'll be inside of this awesome Bank of England scene, and you can look in any direction, and it looks just like you're standing there in the Bank of England. So photorealistic rendering, and what I like to tell people is that photorealism and VR were kind of made for each other. because as soon as you put on that head-mounted display, you have a very accurate sense of the scale of the space around you. And the very next thing that you want is to have it be realistic, right? So never has photorealism been more useful or in more demand than it is now for VR. So super exciting, really hard to do, and in this case we've used the iRay technology in order to accelerate it and be able to generate scenes like this. Okay, so the next technology that I want to talk about is audio, and it's you know, I can go to these events and I can explain about the graphics and the displays and why it's important, and everyone gets it. It's great being in Hollywood talking about audio because you guys understand audio way better than I do, but I can appreciate how important it is. I sit there in a movie and I'm very aware of the fact that it's the audio that brings me in. It sets the tone, it sets the mood, it tells me when I should be excited or scared or nervous. So the audio is super important and also really important in VR. In the same way that it's powerful and that it can draw me in, it can also break a sense of immersion if we get the audio wrong. Okay, so what goes into producing audio? There's three parts to it. The first one is what we'll call synthesis. So this is creating the sounds, the soundtrack, the effects. This part, as I just mentioned, super important. I'm not going to talk very much about it here today. The second part is the sound has to have a direction. It has to be coming from somewhere in the scene. And thirdly, that sound, the source, has to propagate around the scene and make its way to me. It turns out that if you don't do this third part, and I should mention the state of the art for VR audio is that people do the first one and the second one. They give their sound direction. I can turn this way and I can hear it louder in this ear. But they don't actually model propagation. And the reason that they don't model propagation is it's really, really hard. In the same way that it's hard to trace photons around a room and get an accurate result, it's also really hard to trace acoustic waves around a room where they will bounce, they will absorb. But if you don't do that, if you don't take the time to do the acoustics right, you can't tell the difference between sound in a small confined elevator versus sound in a big space like this versus sound, outdoors. And for immersion to be great, those all need to sound different. So we've produced a solution. It's called Bearworks Audio. With Bearworks Audio, we do all of that hard math of tracing sound waves through the scene. The great thing for you is that you and your developers don't have to worry about any of it. It just works. It's just a tool. It's our gift to you. You plug it in, it works, and you have awesome, immersive 3D sound in your virtual environments. The next area that again I want to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit on is touch and physics. And Jason motivated this really well with his example of Everest. Right? If you're up on the top of Everest and you reach to for the whole points to go across the ladder and you don't feel anything, it loses this sense of immersion. So people want to interact with objects in their scenes. It makes sense. And there's two things that you have to do right, accurately, and you have to do them really quickly in order to deliver accurate touch, accurate haptics in the VR environment. One is collision detection. As an object moves towards another object, I need to know exactly when it hits it, right? And if I get the timing wrong, if Jason's mallet goes through the table and he gets that haptic feedback a fraction of a second too late, game over, right? The illusion is broken. So I have to detect when I collide, and I have to model the materials in my scene. I have to get the textures right. It feels different when my finger moves over glass versus over carpet versus over. And if the object is hard, it needs to provide force feedback. And if it's soft and squishy, it needs to give a little bit. The models need to deform. And so NVIDIA has what we call our physics constraint solver. Physics very quickly provides that information about contact back to the game engines so that the game engines can provide that haptic response and that visual response as objects are colliding. The other part about physics is that we want objects in our virtual scene to behave like they would in the real world. In the real world, scenes are not static, things move around, water flows. I want the water in my virtual environments to look and behave like water in the real world. I want fire in my virtual environment to spread like fire spreads in the real world. These things are really hard to do. But this is also in the DNA of NVIDIA because these are features of games. And so we've spent 20 years figuring out how to do these really, really fast. And now we're taking advantage of that technology. We've migrated it into our Bearworks SDK so that you can take advantage of all of these features inside of your VR experiences. And the last one that Jason spent quite a bit of time on is capture. So capture is hard because you can't just do it with one camera. In order to capture a scene like this, I need an array of cameras. And each of those cameras has its own set of intrinsic and extrinsic parameters, right? And so in order to put together the output from this whole array of cameras, you need a stitching SDK, a tool that's going to take those outputs, decode them, calibrate them, right? Each one is separately calibrate them, equalize the color and contrast so that they're all consistent, stitch them up into a single result, encode it, and then send it somewhere to be displayed. Computationally, really intensive. Great news, we've solved this problem, and you get to demo it right over there. So we brought our camera with us today. We brought our software and our hardware that can run this, and you can go over and demo this during the breaks. This system was first demonstrated at SIGGRAPH just a few months ago. So super excited that you're going to get to see it here today. So I touched on a bunch of the technologies, hopefully gave you a flavor for how they work, for the computational challenges associated with them, but also that there are solutions available to you. I didn't go through all of these. There's more technologies inside of our Bearworks SDK, and it's probably worth mentioning this one, GPU Direct for Video. So Michael kicked things off by showing us that, first down line. That's actually created using GPU Direct for Video. So as we mentioned at the beginning, there's a bunch of NVIDIA people floating around here today. Feel free to ask us questions about any of these. There's lots of great information on the website. There's the URL up there. URL is also on a bunch of our handouts. Feel free to ask us questions about these. We'd love to talk about it. It's not a smoke alarm.
And that's not fun.
That's me.
Just a cell phone.
If I can find it, I'll turn it off.
Answer up.
I'll talk to him. It's fine. All right. So at NVIDIA, we've made hardware and software solutions in order to make your VR experiences great. And I started off by mentioning that no one wants to have a bad VR experience. And so that's why we're building all of these technologies. And now it's really up to you. It's up to the content creators. And so my hope is that when you leave here today, and hopefully you've learned a little bit about how VR works, that you'll see opportunities, you'll see places where you can use VR in upcoming projects. And when you do, I hope that you'll pick up the phone or open an email message and reach out to us, because we would love to partner with you on it. We want you to be successful. We want VR in Hollywood to be successful. So with that, I will leave you. I'll thank you for your attention, and we're happy to